Here are 5 quick tips to help you preach better sermons. Hey everyone, it's Pastor Dave and welcome to the channel. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so that you'll always know when the next video drops. Tip number 1 is follow the text, don't force the text. A sermon is not a TED Talk with a few Bible verses thrown in for backup. A sermon follows the lead of the scripture being preached instead of forcing the scripture into your topic or agenda. Now, this doesn't always make preaching easy. Sometimes the text goes in a different direction than you anticipated, or includes stuff that doesn't fit very easily with the theme of your sermon. But always try your best to follow the text instead of forcing it. This will ensure that your sermons are actually sermons and not just speeches. Tip number 2 is to preach one sermon. There's a great story about a new pastor who preached his very first sermon. And afterward, as he was greeting everyone on the way out of church, an older woman came up and said, "Nice sermon series. Preach one sermon per sermon. A sermon should have one main idea or focus that is based on the scripture text. Stick to that main idea and avoid the temptation to say everything that could be said in one sermon. Odds are you're going to be preaching on that same scripture again someday, so save your other ideas for future sermons and just stick to one sermon." Tip number 3 is to use stories, metaphors, and analogies when they actually help. I've known some preachers who were taught to include a story for every single point they make during the sermon, which is fine if the stories are good and actually helpful, but if you're just throwing in a story to meet some arbitrary quota and it doesn't actually help drive home the point of the sermon, then you don't need it and it'll just distract from the sermon. And while stories are certainly engaging and memorable, a good metaphor or analogy can have just as much of an impact, and they usually take up a lot less time. For example, in an old sermon I preached about the importance of the church and how you can't really be a Christian without also being part of the church. I thought about including stories about people who maybe had left the church and tried to be a Christian on their own for a while, but then decided to come back. But in the end, I decided just to use a simple analogy, and I said that trying to be a Christian without the church is like trying to be a soldier without joining the military. Now, 2 caveats about metaphors and analogies. You want to make sure they work well without adding any bad theology into the mix. Sometimes when you use a metaphor or an analogy, you'll need to then quickly point out where they break down and are no longer similar to what the Bible is saying. In fact, that kind of a disclaimer can actually end up being a great segue into your next point. So use stories, metaphors, and analogies, but be careful and only use them when they actually help reinforce your point. Tip number 4 is to keep it brief. My first sermon was 11 minutes long, and the congregation loved me for it. Now that I'm a little more experienced, I've drifted into the 18 to 20 minute range, but I only go over 20 minutes if I have a really good reason. Brevity is not a sign of laziness, it's a sign of care. Abraham Lincoln once wrote a letter to a friend that started by saying, "I'm sorry this letter is so long, I didn't have time to write a shorter one." Short sermons are not bad. Obviously, your church is going to be used to a certain length, so you might have inherited a church that expects 45-minute sermons. But even then, I've never heard someone complain that a sermon was too short. The entire Sermon on the Mount was only about 20 minutes. Besides, once you do go over 20 minutes, it requires different techniques and skills to keep everyone's attention. Just because you can hold their attention for 20 minutes doesn't mean you can hold their attention for an hour, unless you know how to do that. Long speeches and long sermons require different timing and techniques to keep people engaged. Keep your sermons brief, and most of the time, they will be better for it. Tip number 5 is to land the plane. For people in the congregation, some sermons are like watching those videos of planes trying to land in bad weather. Don't drag out the end of your sermon. Don't squeeze in one last point if you can end well without it, and you can almost always end well without it. Just land the plane, put the wheels on the ground. End the sermon as soon as you can without damaging it. All right, so those are 5 tips for preaching better sermons. Again, if you like this video, hit like, subscribe, click the bell to turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.